The courtroom was buzzing, but the judge barely glanced up. A young black teenager stood before him, accused of a crime she didn't commit. He smirked, shaking his head. "You think you understand the law?" he scoffed. The room chuckled. To them, she was just another kid, lost, powerless, out of her league. But what happened next silenced them all. With a calm voice and razor-sharp arguments, she dismantled the prosecution, proving she wasn't just any teenager. She was a legal prodigy in disguise. The judge's smirk vanished, replaced by pure shock. Stay tuned, because this courtroom twist is one you won't believe. We live in a world where people are judged by their looks before their abilities. This story is a perfect example of why that's a mistake. A black teenager walked into court, mocked by a judge who thought she was just another lost kid. But what he didn't know was that she had a secret, one that would leave the entire courtroom in shock. What started as humiliation turned into one of the most jaw-dropping moments in legal history. Stay with me, because this twist will blow your mind. The morning sun streamed through the courtroom windows, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floors. The air was thick with murmurs as lawyers shuffled papers, clerks organized files, and spectators whispered among themselves. It was just another routine day in the justice system. At least, that's what everyone thought. At the center of the room stood a young black teenager, no older than 17. She was dressed in simple, modest clothing, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. To most people in the room, she was just another defendant, a kid who had probably made a bad decision and was now facing the consequences. Seated behind the judge's bench was Judge Robert Alden, a seasoned legal professional with over 20 years on the bench. He had seen thousands of cases come through his courtroom, and to him, this one was no different. He barely spared the teenager a glance as he flipped through her case file, sighing audibly. "Another young one," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man named Mr. Carmichael, smirked as he adjusted his tie. He had no doubt in his mind that this would be an easy case. After all, the defendant was a kid, nervous, inexperienced, and completely out of her depth. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Alden finally looked up. His eyes scanned the girl standing before him, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Curiosity, maybe, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "State your name for the record," he said in a tone laced with indifference. The teenager took a breath and spoke with quiet confidence. "Ava Sinclair, Your Honor." "And do you have legal representation, Miss Sinclair?" Ava shook her head. "No, Your Honor. I will be representing myself." A brief silence fell over the courtroom. Then, almost on cue, a low chuckle rippled through the spectators. Even the prosecutor raised an eyebrow, amused by what he had just heard. Judge Alden smirked. "You'll be representing yourself?" he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You do realize this is a court of law, not a high school debate club, correct?" A few more chuckles echoed in the room. Ava, however, remained completely unfazed. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "And I understand the legal system very well." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying her. He had seen self-representation before, usually from people who had no idea what they were doing. It never ended well. "Miss Sinclair," he began, rubbing his temples, "I highly advise against this. The law is complex. Trained attorneys spend years, decades, learning how to navigate it. And you expect to stand here, with no formal training, and defend yourself?" Ava nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." More whispers. More quiet laughter. Someone in the gallery shook their head in disbelief. The judge exchanged a glance with the prosecutor, who smirked in return. "Well," Judge Alden sighed, "if that's what you want, then so be it. But don't say I didn't warn you." He gestured toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Carmichael, you may proceed with the charges." The prosecutor stood, adjusting his suit. He looked at Ava as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience, a minor obstacle in his otherwise easy morning. "Your Honor, the defendant, Ava Sinclair, is charged with trespassing and property damage. The evidence against her is clear, and we will demonstrate that she had no legal right to be where she was at the time of the incident." He turned to Ava, smirking. Miss Sinclair, do you understand the charges against you? Yes, Mr. Carmichael, she said, her tone neutral. I understand them perfectly. The prosecutor chuckled. Good. Then this should be quick. He launched into his argument, detailing the so-called crime with the air of someone who had already won. He presented witness statements, surveillance footage, and legal precedents, each one seemingly solidifying his case. Judge Alden nodded along, clearly unimpressed by Ava's silence. In his mind, this was a done deal. A teenager without legal training wasn't going to outsmart a seasoned prosecutor. But then, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Miss Sinclair, the judge said, you may present your defense. Ava stepped forward. She placed her hands on the table, straightened her back, and looked directly at the judge. And then, in a voice that carried more authority than anyone expected, she said, Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on assumptions rather than facts. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to systematically dismantle each of their claims. The room went dead silent. Judge Alden blinked. The prosecutor frowned. This wasn't the voice of a scared teenager fumbling through a case. This was the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Proceed, the judge said slowly, leaning forward. Ava nodded. She turned to face the courtroom, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. And then, with the precision of a seasoned lawyer, she began her argument. The words that followed would change everything. The moment Ava opened her mouth, the entire atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The confidence in her voice was undeniable. She wasn't stammering, she wasn't nervous. She was composed, methodical, and eerily precise. Your Honor, Ava began, her eyes steady. The prosecution has painted a picture that is both misleading and incomplete. They claim I was trespassing, yet they fail to acknowledge the legal precedent that directly contradicts their argument. If I may, I'd like to present case law that proves otherwise. The room went silent. The quiet murmurs and hushed laughter from earlier had vanished. The judge's smirk faltered for a split second before returning. He leaned back, arms crossed. Oh, and what case law are you referring to, Miss Sinclair? His tone was amused, but there was a hint of curiosity buried beneath it. Ava didn't hesitate. People v. Richardson, 2015. In that case, the court ruled that a person cannot be convicted of trespassing if they had implied permission to be on the premises. The burden of proof lies on the prosecution to establish that no such permission existed. Your Honor, the prosecution has failed to provide any concrete evidence that I was explicitly barred from entering the property in question. The prosecutor, who had been casually flipping through his notes, suddenly sat up straighter. Judge Alden frowned. You're claiming you had implied permission? Yes, Your Honor, Ava said smoothly. And if the prosecution cannot disprove that, then their entire argument falls apart. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge glanced at the prosecutor, whose expression had tightened. He clearly hadn't expected this. Carmichael cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Miss Sinclair, while that case may be relevant in some instances, it does not override the security footage that places you on private property. Ava nodded. I acknowledge the footage, Mr. Carmichael. But tell me, does the footage show any clear signs indicating that the area was restricted? Were there no trespassing signs? The prosecutor opened his mouth, but Ava continued. And, more importantly, does the footage show me engaging in any illegal activity, or does it simply show me walking onto the premises? The prosecutor hesitated. The judge raised an eyebrow. Carmichael finally spoke. The footage shows you on the property. That, in itself, is enough to establish trespassing. Ava tilted her head slightly. Is it? She turned to the judge. Your Honor, in order to prove trespassing, the prosecution must establish intent. Simply being on a property does not automatically make one guilty of trespassing. If that were the case, every mail carrier, delivery driver, or visitor who accidentally stepped on private land would be guilty of a crime. The judge's smirk disappeared entirely. He shifted in his chair, staring at Ava as if seeing her for the first time. The courtroom was dead silent now. No more whispers, no more snickering. Judge Alden narrowed his eyes. Miss Sinclair, where exactly did you learn all of this? Ava met his gaze without hesitation. From studying, Your Honor. Carmichael scoffed. Studying? Miss Sinclair, do you expect us to believe that you, a teenager, somehow taught yourself criminal law? Ava turned to him, her expression unreadable. Would it be so hard to believe? The prosecutor laughed, shaking his head. Come on. No offense, but legal studies require years of training. You don't just wake up one day and understand case law. Ava didn't flinch. I never said it happened overnight, Mr. Carmichael. I've been studying law since I was 12. Another murmur spread through the room. The judge's eyebrows lifted. You're saying you've been studying law for 5 years? Yes, Your Honor. I started reading legal textbooks when I was in middle school. By the time I was 14, I was assisting in real legal cases through a mentorship program. I've spent countless hours analyzing court rulings, dissecting legal arguments, and understanding constitutional law. Carmichael let out an incredulous chuckle. You expect us to believe that? Ava didn't react. Instead, she turned back to the judge. Your Honor, if I were an adult saying these same things, would you still be questioning me? Judge Alden blinked. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence was deafening. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The reason they were so skeptical wasn't because her arguments lacked substance. It was because she was young, because she was black, because she didn't fit the image of what they thought a legal expert should look like. Judge Alden cleared his throat. Miss Sinclair, while your knowledge is impressive, I must remind you that real legal expertise comes with experience. Ava nodded. I agree, Your Honor. But experience doesn't always mean time. It means ability. And if I may, I'd like to continue proving my case. The judge hesitated. Then, slowly, he gestured for her to continue. Ava turned back to the prosecutor, a small, unreadable smile on her lips. Mr. Carmichael, you stated that the footage alone proves my guilt, but I'd like to introduce counter-evidence. She reached into her neatly organized files and pulled out a stack of documents. I have here a sworn statement from the property owner himself, Ava continued. In it, he confirms that I had been on the premises before with no objections. If that's the case, then the claim of trespassing is already weakened. The judge leaned forward, reaching for the documents. He scanned them carefully. Carmichael frowned. This doesn't change. Ava lifted a hand. I'm not done. She reached for another document. This is a transcript from a similar case that was thrown out due to a lack of clear trespassing intent. Another murmur swept through the room. Ava turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I ask that these documents be admitted into evidence. Judge Alden looked from the papers to Ava, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he gave a single nod. Admitted, he said. A collective gasp filled the room. Ava stood there, calm and composed, while the courtroom around her slowly began to realize what was happening. This wasn't just a teenager trying to defend herself. This was someone who understood the law better than most professionals in the room. And the judge, who had mocked her only minutes ago, was now taking her very, very seriously. The entire courtroom was now captivated. What started as a routine case had turned into something extraordinary. Ava Sinclair, the teenager everyone had underestimated, was systematically tearing apart the prosecution's argument. Judge Alden, who had been dismissive at first, now leaned forward, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor, Mr. Carmichael, who had once looked smug and confident, now looked unsettled. He had expected an easy win, but instead, he found himself in the middle of a legal battle he wasn't prepared for. Ava cleared her throat and continued. Your Honor, the prosecution has relied heavily on the idea that I was on private property unlawfully. However, as I've already established, I had been on the property before without issue. Now, I'd like to address the second charge, property damage. Carmichael immediately jumped in, trying to regain control. Miss Sinclair, the damage to the property was documented. There's physical evidence, photographs, reports, proving that vandalism occurred that night. Ava nodded. That's true. But what the prosecution has failed to do is prove that I was responsible for that damage. A slight gasp rippled through the audience. Ava turned back to the judge. Your Honor, while the presence of property damage is undisputed, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. They must establish beyond a reasonable doubt that I was the one who committed the act. So far, they have failed to do that. The judge folded his hands together. Miss Sinclair, are you saying you have an alibi? Yes, Your Honor. Ava stepped forward, holding another document in her hand. On the night in question, I was across town at a study session with my peers. I have signed statements from multiple witnesses who can verify my location during the time of the alleged incident. Carmichael stiffened. Witnesses? Who exactly are these witnesses? Ava flipped through her papers. 2 of my teachers and 3 classmates. They have provided sworn affidavits confirming that I was with them during the time the crime took place. I also have time-stamped text messages from that night proving that I was discussing case law with my study group. The prosecutor's face turned red. He hadn't anticipated this. Judge Alden took the documents and examined them carefully. The silence in the room was thick. Ava continued, her voice unwavering. The prosecution's entire case hinges on circumstantial evidence. They claim I trespassed, yet they cannot prove that I wasn't allowed on the property. They claim I caused damage, yet they have no direct evidence linking me to the crime. The law is clear, Your Honor. Without sufficient proof, a conviction cannot be made. The judge set the documents down, tapping his fingers on the desk. Mr. Carmichael, he said slowly, do you have any counter-evidence to refute Miss Sinclair's alibi? The prosecutor's jaw clenched. He quickly flipped through his papers, scanning for something, anything, that could salvage his case. But there was nothing. Ava had completely dismantled his argument. After a long pause, Carmichael finally let out a frustrated sigh. No, Your Honor. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Alden leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He glanced at Ava, then at the prosecution, then back at Ava. Miss Sinclair, he said after a moment, you have provided an alibi, successfully challenged the trespassing charge, and raised reasonable doubt about the property damage claim. Based on the evidence, or lack thereof, it appears that the prosecution has failed to meet the burden of proof required for a conviction. The prosecutor's face fell. Ava, however, remained poised. She had expected this outcome, but she didn't allow herself to celebrate. Not yet. Judge Alden drummed his fingers on the bench before sighing. In light of the evidence presented, the court finds that the prosecution has not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. He looked directly at Ava. Miss Sinclair, the charges against you are hereby dismissed. A collective gasp spread through the room, followed by a stunned silence. Then, suddenly, whispers erupted from the audience. Spectators exchanged shocked glances. Even the court clerks looked surprised. Ava stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of the judge's words. Not guilty. The judge adjusted his glasses, still watching her carefully. Miss Sinclair, he said, his voice softer now, I must admit, I misjudged you. Ava met his gaze. Yes, Your Honor. You did. A tense beat passed between them. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the judge let out a quiet chuckle. I can't say I've ever seen anything like this before, he admitted. You may not have a law degree yet, but you have a sharp legal mind. Ava gave a small nod. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge exhaled and tapped his gavel against the bench. Case dismissed. The sound of the gavel echoed throughout the courtroom. The spectators, many of whom had doubted Ava from the start, now murmured in astonishment. Reporters in the back scribbled furiously in their notepads. Even the defense attorneys who had been watching the case out of curiosity looked impressed. As Ava turned to leave, Carmichael, the prosecutor, called out to her. Miss Sinclair, he said, his tone unreadable. She turned to face him. He hesitated for a moment, then let out a breath. You're good, he admitted. Really good. Ava gave a small smile. I know. And with that, she picked up her files, straightened her shoulders, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned audience, a speechless judge, and a prosecutor who had just learned a very valuable lesson. As Ava walked out of the courtroom, the weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a dense fog. The judge, the attorneys, the spectators, everyone was still processing the unexpected turn of events. Judge Alden, the man who had initially mocked Ava, sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He had prided himself on being able to read people the moment they stepped into his courtroom. But today, he had been proven wrong, spectacularly wrong. He turned to his clerk. "Pull up everything you can find on Ava Sinclair." The clerk nodded and began typing furiously. Within minutes, a file appeared on the judge's screen. As he skimmed through the documents, his expression shifted from curiosity to pure disbelief. Ava Sinclair wasn't just any teenager. She was a prodigy. At 12 years old, she had started reading legal textbooks, not because anyone forced her to, but because she was fascinated by the law. By 14, she had participated in mock trials at a local university, often out-arguing college students twice her age. And by 16, she had been quietly assisting pro bono lawyers, helping with real cases, researching legal loopholes, and crafting arguments that had led to dismissed charges. Alden shook his head in astonishment. He had underestimated her, not because she lacked skill, but because he had assumed, like so many others, that her age, her background, and the color of her skin meant she couldn't possibly have the intellect to stand in his courtroom as an equal. And yet, she had. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Ava was surrounded by a small crowd of people. Some were reporters, eager to capture the moment. Others were strangers who had witnessed her case unfold and wanted to shake her hand. A journalist stepped forward. "Miss Sinclair, how does it feel to have just won your own case against a professional prosecutor?" Ava smiled politely but remained humble. It was never about winning. It was about justice. Another reporter asked, "What's next for you? Will you pursue law as a career?" Ava's eyes glimmered with quiet confidence. "I already am." The crowd erupted in murmurs of approval. Just then, a familiar voice interrupted. "Miss Sinclair." Ava turned to see Judge Alden walking toward her. The reporters immediately backed away, sensing that something important was about to happen. The judge stopped in front of her, hands in his pockets. For a moment, he simply studied her, as if seeing her for the first time. Then, in a voice far different from the one he had used inside the courtroom, he spoke. "I owe you an apology." Ava tilted her head slightly but said nothing. She wanted to hear him out. Judge Alden sighed. "When you walked into my courtroom today, I made an assumption about you. I saw a young black teenager standing alone, without a lawyer, and I assumed you were in over your head. I was wrong." Ava held his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor. You were." He let out a quiet chuckle. "You don't pull any punches, do you?" "No, sir." Alden nodded. "Good. Because that's exactly what makes you a great legal mind." He took a deep breath. "I've seen seasoned attorneys who couldn't argue a case the way you just did. You have a gift, Ava. And if you ever decide to officially pursue law, I have no doubt you'll be one of the best." Ava considered his words for a moment before speaking. "Thank you, Your Honor." He extended his hand. "I hope to see you back in my courtroom someday, but next time, as a practicing attorney." Ava hesitated for only a second before shaking his hand. "I'll see you then." With that, Judge Alden gave her one last nod and walked away, leaving Ava standing there with a quiet but powerful realization. She had just proven something not only to the courtroom but to the world. That intelligence knows no age. That talent knows no race. And that no matter how many people underestimate you, the truth will always have the final word. Ava Sinclair walked into that courtroom as just another underestimated teenager. But she walked out as a legend. She didn't just defend herself. She exposed the biases, shattered expectations, and proved that brilliance knows no boundaries. The judge who mocked her, left speechless. The prosecutor who doubted her, defeated. And the entire courtroom, witnessed history. This story isn't just about Ava. It's about challenging the limits people try to place on us. Because when you know your worth, no one can deny you your place. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Robert's Story. More powerful stories are coming your way.